They expected medical assistance, got human warships instead. The beacon came in at 3:47. Ship time, and I was elbowed deep in a burst coolant line when Lieutenant Petra Hale shoved a data tablet in my face. I looked at it, then I looked at it again. Is this real? I asked. Command confirmed. It's 6 minutes ago, Petra said. We're already being redirected. I handed her the wrench, wiped my hands on a cloth, and read the message a third time. The Velhari Collective, a species I had treated exactly once before. A delegation of 3 officials who came aboard the UHS Florence Nightingale 14 months ago with a respiratory infection and a deep distrust of anything that moved faster than a train negotiation. They were careful people, methodical, the kind of species that sent 3 ambassadors just to agree on what time to have breakfast. They did not send distress signals without thinking it through first. The message was short. The Dra Dominion had entered their home system without invitation and without warning. The Velhari were requesting immediate humanitarian assistance, medical teams, supplies boned. They were very specific: no weapons, no military vessels. The Dra had agreed to allow safe passage for humanitarian ships only, and the Velhari were asking Earth to honor that condition. They were asking for doctors. I'm a doctor. Commander Yara Oe, Chief Medical Liaison, United Human Sovereignty Hospital Ship Florence Nightingale. I have been a doctor for 19 years. And before that, I was a field medic in the outer colonies. And before that, I was a girl in Accra who wanted to understand why people hurt. I have never fired a weapon in my life. I am by every definition exactly what the Velhari asked for. So is my ship, the Florence Nightingale. Carries no guns. Her hull is painted white with Red Cross markers that are recognized under every interstellar humanitarian convention in existence. She holds 412 medical staff, 3 surgical theaters, 2 intensive care wards, a pharmaceutical manufacturing lab, a trauma center, and enough blood equivalent fluid to fill a small lake. She does not carry torpedoes. She does not carry Marines. She carries bandages and bone regenerators and people like me who chose to spend their lives putting other people back together. The ship changed course. I went back to my quarters, updated my log, and tried to sleep. I could not sleep. There was something wrong about the speed of it, not the Velhari message. That made sense. They were under siege, and they needed help. And they sent out a call. What felt strange was us. Earth's response had come through before I even finished reading the message. The Florence Nightingale was already being rerouted before most of her crew knew why. Command had acknowledged the Velhari request in 4 minutes, which was I checked because I am someone who checks things 17 times faster than our average response time to humanitarian distress. Signal. I wrote in my log, someone was waiting for this call. Then I closed the log, closed my eyes, and listened to the hum of the ship moving through the dark. Velarath was 3 days away at standard jump. We made it in 2 when we dropped out of faster than light travel in the system resolved on the forward display. I was standing on the bridge because Dr. Harlan, our ship's captain, had asked me to be there. He said it was protocol for the medical liaison to be present during first contact with a distress zone. I suspect he wanted someone next to him who looked calm. I'm good at looking calm. It is a skill I developed early. The way all doctors do, because the moment a patient sees fear in your eyes, they stop trusting that you can save them. And the moment they stop trusting you, your job gets 3 times harder. The Velhari home system was beautiful. The way a storm is beautiful. 2 blue, green planets orbited a warm yellow star. The third planet, Velcherarth Prime, hung in the center of the display, like a bruised eye, and around it, in formations that caught the starlight, like dark knives, sat the Drath fleet. They were not a small fleet. 14 cruisers, 32 patrol frigates, 6 heavy carriers, each one bigger than anything I had ever seen in person. The DRA-3 had been building up their military capacity for 40 years, while everyone else talked about trade and diplomacy. And looking at those ships, I understood for the first time what 40 years of quiet building actually produced. It produced this. A jaw clamped shut around a planet. They're scanning us, Petra said from her station. Let them, Captain Harlan said. We have nothing to hide. I thought about that phrase. We have nothing to hide. It is one of those sentences that sounds reassuring until you examine it from the other direction. The DRA-3 were looking at a white hospital ship with red markers and no weapons, and what they saw was a confirmation of what the Velhari had promised. Earth was playing by the rules. Earth was sending doctors. That is what they saw. We crossed into the system, slowly broadcasting our medical clearance codes on every frequency the DRA-3 used. There was a long pause. Then a single DRA-3 patrol frigate moved to intercept us, not aggressively, but the way a guard dog moves when you approach a fence, not barking, just making sure you know it is there. We matched course. Our codes were verified. The frig pulled back. We were allowed through. Valhalla transport that met us was old, scratched hull patch stabilizers, the kind of ship that had been repaired so many times it was more repair than original. 3 Valhari officials came aboard. They were tall, thin, limbed, with wide amber eyes and the pale gray skin of people who had not slept properly in weeks. The lead official, Consul, shook my hand with both of his, which I understood from our briefing materials was a Velhari gesture of profound gratitude. We're glad you came, he said. His translator clicked softly at his collar. We did not know if you would. We came as soon as we received your message, I told him, which was the truth. He looked at me with those wide eyes, and I saw something in them that I recognized from every patient I have ever treated who was trying to decide whether or not to let themselves hope. It is one of the most painful expressions a face can carry. Only your ship, he asked. That is what was agreed, I said. He nodded slowly. He did not look relieved. He looked like someone who had expected a larger answer and was adjusting to a smaller one. I took the Velhari officials to our main conference room and began the intake process. How many wounded, what injuries, what medical supplies were most needed, how many civilians, what was the current humanitarian situation. On the surface, Consul Saravin answered everything precisely the way Velhari always do, with exact numbers and organized priority lists, but there was a fragility underneath his precision that told me he was working very hard to hold himself together. I have seen it before. People in crisis often get very organized. It is the mind's way of maintaining ground when the ground is disappearing. We were 40 minutes into the briefing when my personal communicator buzzed. I glanced at it. Under the table, it was a message from Captain Har, 3 words, look at. Sensors. I excused myself for a moment and walked to the nearest display panel. In the corridor outside, the sensor screen was full of light, new contacts, appearing at the edge of the system. Dozens of them. They were dropping out of faster-than-light travel in organized formation, which meant this was not an accident and it was not a coincidence. Formation drops take planning, they take coordination, they take someone who knew well in advance exactly where to be and exactly when. I watched the contacts multiply, 50, then 80, then over 100. Every one of them was a human warship. I stood in that corridor for a moment, my hand against the wall, and I counted backwards from 10, the way my first mentor taught me when I was 22 years old, and my hands would not stop shaking. I went back into the conference room. Consul Saravin looked up from his lists. He must have read something in my expression, because his own expression shifted not to panic to very old, very practiced kind of resignation. How many? He asked quietly. I thought about what to say. I thought about what the sensor screen had shown me. I thought about those amber eyes and what was behind them, and I thought about the Drathri fleet sitting outside like a fist around his world. Enough, I said. He was quiet for a long moment, then so softly I almost did not hear it over the hum of the ship's recycled air. We only asked for doctors. I looked at him. I thought about that sensor screen. I thought about the response time for minutes, 17 times faster than average. Yes, I said. You did. And outside in the dark between the stars, humanity arrived. The Admiral came aboard at 600. I knew something significant was happening because Captain Harlan changed his uniform twice, which I had never seen him do, and because every crew member in the corridors was moving with a particular kind of energy, not panicked but heightened, the way people move when they understand that the situation has changed and they are waiting to find out exactly how. Admiral Lawrence Bray was a compact man, short, broad-shouldered, with close-cropped gray hair and the kind of face that had been difficult to read for so long and had forgotten how to do anything else. He arrived with 2 aides and a data case and shook my hand the way people shake hands when they already thinking about the next thing. Commander Owie, he said, I've read your file. I've read nothing about any of this, I said. He smiled. It was a small smile, the kind that acknowledges a fair point without conceding anything. Walk with me. We walked to the observation deck, which is a long curved room on the port side of the Florence Nightingale, with a wide viewport that shows you the stars and whatever is in front of them. What was in front of them now was the human fleet, 114 ships organized into 3 main groups, 6 dreadnoughts at the center, heavy and dark and enormous in a way that made the DRA-3 carriers look like patrol boats by comparison. Around them, a rotating screen of cruisers and frigates in overlapping defensive patterns, and at the edges, destroyers moving in pairs, quiet and fast like dogs circling the outside of fence. I stood at the viewport and looked at it for a moment. Directive Shepherd, Admiral Bray said, standing beside me. I had not heard that phrase before. I told him so. Most people haven't, he said. It was written into the Interstellar Humanitarian Accords 17 years ago. Subsection 14, paragraph 9. It's very dry reading. Most diplomats skimmed it. He paused. The DRA-3 definitely didn't. Read it, he explained it to me then. Quietly with a viewport full of warships. Behind him, under the humanitarian. Accords any humanitarian vessel operating in a conflict zone had the legal right to request a protective escort. The escort could be any size. The requesting party did not need to announce the escort in advance. Only the humanitarian vessel needed to be invited. The Velhari had invited the Florence Nightingale. The Florence Nightingale was a humanitarian vessel. Therefore, under interstellar law, she was entitled to an escort. 114 warships was a perfectly legal escort. I stared at him. The Velhari didn't know about this. No, he said they asked for doctors. Genuinely, they had no idea this would happen. That's correct. And we had Directive Shepherd ready to execute the moment a legitimate humanitarian request came in from a system under DRA pressure. He said, "We've been waiting for that request for about 3 years. The Velhari were always the most likely candidate, neutral, non-aggressive, valuable trade networks. And the Drag 3 want their system for the same reason everyone does. The shipping lanes run through it. We knew eventually they'd push. We were positioned." I turned back to the viewport. The fleet out. There was not a response. It was a plan. The Florence Nightingale, my ship, my white-painted unarmed ship full of doctors and nurses and blood equivalent fluid, had been the key, not the weapon. The key, someone had to open the door. And the only door the DRA had agreed to open was the one marked humanitarian assistance. "You used us," I said. "I used a legal mechanism." He said, "You were never in danger. The moment the Florence Nightingale crossed into this system, we were 30 seconds behind her. The Drag 3 couldn't have touched you before we were here." "That isn't the point." "I know," he said, and for the first time, something in his voice shifted just slightly into a register that felt less rehearsed. "I know it isn't, but look at what's on that planet, Commander. They've been under siege for 11 days. Their orbital infrastructure is cut off. They can't get food shipments in. They can't get their wounded out. 11 days." He paused. "We had a legal mechanism. We used it. I would make the same decision again." I thought about Consul Sarah's face in the conference room, the way he had asked how many and accepted my answer with that old resigned quiet. He knew something was different. I said, "When I came back from looking at the sensors," he asked me how many before I said a word. "The Velhari are perceptive." He said they only asked for doctors. The Admiral looked at me. "They did, and they have them. They also have 114 warships between their planet and the Drag 3 fleet, and as of 40 minutes ago the siege corridors are open and the first food transports are moving." He picked up his data case. "How is the triage situation?" I looked at him for a long moment and I let out a breath. "We need to prioritize pediatric cases," I said. "The Velhari have a biological vulnerability in the youngest age group. Respiratory stress from the atmospheric disruption the DRA-3 orbital presence has caused. I'll need an extra team on that. You'll have whatever you need, and I want Consul Saravin told the truth," I said, "about Directive Shepherd, about the fact that we were waiting for this. He deserves to know." The Admiral held my gaze. "Agreed. That conversation should come from you, I think." I nodded and left him at the viewport. The Florence Nightingale was already busy. Velhari transport ships had begun docking at our external bays and the first patients were coming through, mostly children and elderly, the ones the Velhari had prioritized in their evacuation order. I moved through the intake bay watching my teams work with the quiet efficiency that comes from training and good people. Petra Hale was coordinating the intake lists with 3 Velhari medics who had come aboard with the transports. Dr. Callum, our head of pediatrics, had already set up a secondary triage area in Bay 4 and was moving through it with a focus calm that I had always admired. In him, the kind of calm that is not distance but is rather something that has been built slowly over years, brick by brick, out of the decision to care about people without being destroyed by it. On the other side of the ship, through the sealed hatches that divided the medical sections from the operational deck, I could hear the different sound of the escort fleet. Coordination channels, low-clipped voices, the language of people managing very large weapons in very small spaces. It was a sound I was not used to hearing on my ship, and it sat in my body like a low vibration I could not quite locate. I found Consul Saravan in the family waiting area outside the children's ward, sitting with his hands folded on his knees, watching the door with those wide amber eyes. I sat down next to him. "I need to tell you something," I said. He turned to look at me. There was no surprise in his expression, only that readiness, that careful stillness of someone who has already prepared themselves to hear difficult things. I told him about Directive Shepherd. I told him about the 17 years, the subsection, the paragraph that nobody had bothered to read closely. I told him that Earth had been waiting for a legitimate request from a Velhari citizen in a conflict zone, and that when his message came through, the fleet was already organized and waiting to move. He listened without interrupting. That is another thing I have noticed about the Velhari. They are excellent listeners. They do not fill silence with their own reactions. They hold it, and they think and they respond when they have something real to say. When I finished, he was quiet for a while. "So, we were the door," he said finally. "Yes. And you, the Florence Nightingale, were the key." "Yes." He looked at his folded hands. "And if we had not sent the message, if we had been too afraid to ask, or if we had asked another species instead, I don't know," I said. "I think eventually the Drag 3 would have moved somewhere else, and Earth would have found another door." He nodded slowly. Then he said something that I have written in my log and read many times. "Since we asked for medicine, we received a shield. I do not know if I am grateful or afraid. You can be both." I said. "It is allowed." The door to the children's ward opened, and a Velhari nurse looked out, said something in her own language. Consulin stood up immediately, and I saw his face change into something that was not the consul, not the diplomat, but just a person who needed to know if someone on the other side of that door was going to be all right. He went through the door. I sat alone in the waiting area for a moment, listening to the distant hum of 114 warships holding formation outside my windows. Then I stood up, put on my gloves, and went back to work. The first complication came from subby Jim and Croft 3 days later, and it came in the form of a transmission that was not quite a threat, but arranged itself close enough to one that nobody who heard it was confused about its intent. He contacted the Florence Nightingale directly, not the fleet, not Admiral Bray, my ship specifically, because my Ship was the humanitarian vessel, and humanitarian vessels operated under different protocols, and I think Kroth believed that a woman in a white coat would be softer ground than a fleet admiral. I took the transmission in the main communications room with Captain Harlem beside me and an audio recorder running, because I have learned that in any conversation where the other party might later claim they said something different from what they said, the recording is the most important person in the room. Kroth was tall by Dractory standards, which meant he was enormous. By ours, gray-skilled with a flat, broad forehead that indicated high rank among his people, and eyes that were a pale, unsettling copper color. He looked at me the way certain patients look at a doctor who has just told them something they did not want to hear, not with anger exactly, but with a particular combination of disbelief and resentment that comes from having expected a different answer. Commander Owe, he said. His translator was better than the Valharis, clearer. You're a medical officer. I am, I said. Then you understand that your presence here is the legal foundation for this fleet's claim to be in this system. I understand that the Florence Nightingale responded to a legitimate humanitarian distress call from Valhari citizens, I said, under the interstellar humanitarian accords which your government signed 12 years ago. We signed an accord about the treatment of wounded personnel, not about subsection 14, I said. Paragraph 9, the protective escort provision. Your government's legal team should have flagged it. I'm sorry they didn't. Silence. Those copper eyes looked at me. I kept my hand still on the table and my face exactly as neutral as I have spent 19 years learning to keep it. We had an agreement with the Valhari, he said. Safe passage for medical ships, not for war fleets. The medical ship has a legal escort, I said. The escort is here to ensure the safety of the medical mission. That's the purpose of the provision. 114 warships, he said, is not an escort. It is an invasion. It is not an invasion, I said. Not a single human ship has crossed into Valhari sovereign space without authorization. They are in the outer system subage, exactly where they are permitted to be, and they will remain there until the humanitarian mission is complete. And when will the mission be complete? I looked at him steadily. When the humanitarian situation is resolved. More silence. Longer this time. You are a doctor, he said again, and this time the words had a different shape to them, not dismissive, but something closer to genuinely puzzled, as though he was trying to understand how someone whose job was healing could sit across a communication channel in the middle of all this and speak so quietly. I said. Then how can you be part of this? It was an honest question. I could hear it in his voice. I thought about my answer for a moment, which is something I almost never do in a difficult conversation, because hesitation can be read as weakness. But I thought Kroth deserved a real answer, not a polished one, because I said, in my experience, the wounded always need someone to protect them, and the ones who need protecting always need someone to treat their wounds. Both things are true at the same time. Your fleet put people in a position where they need both. We provide both. He looked at me. Then the transmission ended. Captain Harland let out a slow breath. That went better than I expected. I picked up my recorder and stood up. It went exactly as he intended it to. He was not trying to persuade me, Captain. He was deciding whether I was Worth talking to, and I thought about. Those copper eyes, I think he's still deciding. The second week brought the work, which is what I mean when I say I am a doctor. Not the policy discussions, not the legal frameworks, not the careful diplomatic chess that was being played on the operational side of the ship. The worker patients came in waves, and we treated them in waves, and between the waves my teams ate, rested, sanitized, restocked, and prepared for the next one. Callum Rowe barely slept. I watched him and said nothing because I was doing the same thing, and we both knew it. And there's a kind of silent agreement that exists among doctors who are inside something large and necessary. You push until the work asks you to stop, and you stop only as long as it takes to be ready to push again. On day 9, something happened that I did not expect. A damaged draw shuttle drifted across the outer boundary of sovereign space. It had been in what the fleet logs called a debris event from a minor skirmish 3 days earlier, and it had been traveling on inertia since then. Its pilot unconscious, its navigation system gone. It crossed into our monitored area, and the fleet picked it up, and someone made a decision. I am told it was a lieutenant junior grade named Oliver Webb, 24 years old, 3 years out of the Naval Academy, who made the call to retrieve it before asking anyone senior for permission. I'm glad he did. The pilot was Drag 3, male, mid-rank, with injuries that were serious enough to require surgery, and serious enough that without it he would not have survived another 6 hours. His name, according to his personal tags, was Tactical Officer Renick. We brought him a bay too. I performed the surgery myself. It took 4 hours and involved 2 of his internal organs and a piece of shrapnel that had worked its way into a location that would have eventually caused catastrophic failure. When I finished and stepped back from the table, my hands were tired and my back ached, and Officer Renick's vitals were stable. He woke up the next day. I was charting at the small desk in the corner of his bay when his eyes opened, and he looked at the ceiling for a while, and then he turned his head and looked at me. I said, "Good morning, you're going to be fine." He looked at me, at the white coat, at the room around him. His face went through several things very quickly. Then he turned away from me and said nothing. I noted it in his chart, finished my documentation, and left. On my way out, Petra fell in his step beside me. "How'd that go?" she asked. "He's alive and angry," I said. "That's fine. Angry means they're processing. I'll take alive and angry over the alternative." She nodded. "The sub-B Gimmon knows we have him. There was a communication about it this morning, and he did not request his officer's return." She said he acknowledged the retrieval and said nothing else. I thought about that. The DRA-3 government had been told one of their own was being treated on a human hospital ship, and their senior commander had said nothing. Not thank you, not return him immediately. Nothing. I did not know what to make of it, and I have long since learned that the things I do not know what to make of are usually the things that matter most. So I filed it carefully and kept moving. Renick was in Bay 2 for 11 days. He did not speak to me again for the first 7. On the 8th day I came in for morning rounds, and he said, without looking at me, "The food is strange. We can adjust it." I said, "Tell me what you need." He did not respond, but the next morning there was a list on his bedside table. I had it sent to the galley. By day 10 he was eating, and by Day 11, his recovery was far enough along that I could authorize a lower level monitoring protocol and reassign his Bane nurse to a higher need patient. On the morning of day 11, I came for my final check before clearing him for transfer to a recovery area. He was sitting up. He looked at me with those pale copper eyes, the same color as see-throughs, and said very flatly, "You did not have to bring me in." "Of course we did," I said. "I am Dracy. You were injured," I said. "That's the only category that matters to me." He said nothing. I completed my check as I was writing the final note. In his chart, he said, still without any particular expression, "You are not what we were told." I looked up. "What were you told?" But he had turned away again. And he did not answer, and I did not push him because I have learned that some things need to arrive in their own time, and pushing only sends them further away. I wrote in my log that evening, "He is alive, he is angry, he is, I think, confused." Welcome, I thought, to the feeling. The third week of the mission brought the event that changed everything, and it arrived at 1417 hours on a Tuesday, which I always find strange about critical moments. They do not arrive in the dramatic hours, the middle of the night, or the quiet of the early morning. They arrive in the unremarkable middle of the afternoon, when people are at their desks and the ship smells like recycled coffee and everything seems, for just a moment, almost manageable. The transport was called the Velharit, a Velhari civilian vessel carrying 209 people, most of them families evacuating from one of the surface settlements that had lost power to its environmental systems. It was moving through the humanitarian corridor that the human fleet had established and announced publicly, a protected lane through which civilian transports could move without risk of interdiction. The DRA-3 patrol frigate that fired on it did not send a warning. 2 Velhari were killed immediately, 19 were injured. The Velharit vented atmosphere from her secondary hull and lost power to her drive systems. She was drifting and damaged and full of people, and the nearest drag ship was 6 seconds away, and the nearest human ship was 4 seconds away. The human ship arrived first. I will not describe the political aftermath here in the detail it probably deserves, because I lived through it and it still sits to me like a cold stone, and I am not yet ready to examine it from every angle. What I will say is this: the Velhar reached my docking bay within 20 minutes, and what came off of her changed the air in my ship, changed it the way a shift in weather changes the air in a room, and we worked in that changed air for 6 hours without stopping. 19 injured, 2 of them critically enough that we nearly lost them. 1 Velhari child 4 years old, who had been in the section of the hole that vented. I will not write what that was like. I will only write that Dr. Callum Rowe saved that child's life in a procedure that I would not have attempted, and that I watched through the surgery bay window with my hands pressed flat against the glass, and that when it was done and the child's vitals stabilized, Callum sat down on the floor of the scrub area and stayed there for a while, and I let him, because there are moments when the only right thing you can do for someone is let them have a moment. Admiral Bray moved the fleet not to engage, not immediately, but the entire human formation shifted, tightened, and enclosed. Every Dractory vessel in the system was suddenly boxed, not blocked, not targeted, but surrounded in a way that was impossible to misread. No transmissions were sent No warnings were issued. The fleet simply moved in complete silence into a configuration that said everything that needed to be said without saying a word. Then Admiral Bray asked me to go to Croft's flagship. I was still in my scrub clothes. I had blood on my sleeve that I had not noticed. I washed my hands, changed my coat, and accepted the escort shuttle. The Drag 3 flagship was called the Hej Yemen's Fist, which I thought was a very accurate name for a very large ship full of very serious people who were currently discovering that being serious was not the same as being the most serious person in the room. I boarded through the secondary airlock with 2 human naval officers behind me and a DRA-3 escort in front, and I walked through corridors that smelled like metal and dry, recycled air, and something slightly sharper that might have been tension. The command level was a long room with low lighting and a curved ceiling that made it feel like the inside of a hell-breath. Cross stood at the far end with 6 of his officers arranged behind him. Every one of them was looking at me. I walked the length of that room in my white coat, still slightly damp at the collar from the surgery bay, and I thought about the Velhar and the child on the floor of Callum Surgery Bay, and I thought about 209 people moving through a protected corridor that had been violated by a frigate that belonged to the fleet. This room commanded. I stopped in front of CR. I did not raise my voice. There was no reason to raise my voice. Humanitarian corridor is not a suggestion. I said it is a protected lane established under accords your government has signed. What happened to the Velhar today was a violation of those accords and a violation of the agreement you made with the Velhari when you permitted safe passage for medical vessels. It will not happen again. I was there for 8 minutes, then I walked back down the length of that room and out through the airlock and into the shuttle, and I held myself very still the entire way back to the Florence Nightingale. And when the airlock sealed and I was back inside my own ship in the corridor that smelled like antiseptic and warm recycled air, I put my hand on the wall and stayed there for a moment. Petra appeared. She looked at me. She said nothing, which is one of the things I appreciate most about her. He did not say a word. I told her the entire time I was talking. Not a single officer that room moved or spoke. Not CR, not any of them. Are you all right? I thought about it honestly, which is something I try to do when someone asked me that question. I think so, I said. I think they didn't know what to do with a woman in a white coat standing in a room full of warship commanders and telling them what was not allowed. I pushed off the wall. I have rounds. Come find me if anything changes. She did not need to find me. Nothing changed. The corridor held. Croft's fleet did not fire again, and I wrote him my log that evening with tired hands. The most dangerous thing I did today was walk into that room. The most powerful thing I did today was walk out of it. The battle came on day 26, and it came because I decided that mathematics was on his side. I know this because we intercepted his tactical communications, which is to say the fleet did, and which is to say that Admiral Bray knew what was coming approximately 14 hours before it came. I know this because he told me. He came to my office, sat down across from my desk, and said, I want you to hear this from me. There will be a military engagement tomorrow morning. The DRA are going to attempt a coordinated strike. We are ready. I looked at him. The the patience. The Florence Nightingale will be in the center formation, 6 ships on every side, nobody gets near you, and the Valhari transports in transit. We've suspended civilian movement for the next 18 hours. All transports have been recalled to holding orbits. I nodded. I thought about what it meant to be in the center of a battle. What do you need from me? I asked. He looked at something past my shoulder for a moment. Beds, he said, and whatever you need to fill them. I had the teams prepped by 0200. Every surgical theater, every recovery ward, every available surface reorganized for surge capacity. Callum did not ask why. Petra did not ask why. They saw the configuration, and they move. Because that is what good medical people do when they understand that something is coming. They prepare and they wait. And they do not flinch, and when arrives, they're already running. I was in the trauma center when the shooting started. I did not see the battle. I want to say that plainly because I think there is sometimes a temptation in stories like this one to place the narrator at the center of every event, to have them witness everything, to construct a neat line of sight between the teller and the told. I was not on the bridge. I was in my ship's core in a room with artificial light and recycled air. And what I knew about the battle outside, I knew from the sound of it, which is to say the sound of my ship's own structural responses, the vibration of the hull when nearby detonations moved through the medium of space, and the communications traffic that Petra was monitoring at a tablet on the far side of the room and relaying to me in short, clear sentences as she worked. Fleet is engaged, she said. Draw have committed their full strike force. I was elbowed deep in a chest wound. I said nothing. Human formation is holding 2 frigates pulled out of position to intercept a flanking element. The gap closed in 11 seconds. Clamp, I said. Nurse Oliver Webb, yes. The same Lieutenant Junior grade who had retrieved Rennick's shuttle, who had apparently decided that his natural home was wherever the most difficult thing was happening, handed me the clamp. He had transferred to medical support duty 3 days earlier, and he was the quickest learner I had seen in years. The DRA-3 heavy carriers are pulling back, Petra said. 3 of their cruisers are. She paused. Down Vinning atmosphere. The fleet has taken 2 frigates out of action, and 1 destroyer has sustained significant damage. I finished the chest closure. I moved to the next table. The battle lasted 1 hour and 42 minutes. Croth's mathematics had been correct, but his variables had been wrong. He had calculated the size of the human fleet, the response times he had observed over 3 weeks, the coverage gaps he had measured. What he had not correctly calculated was what happens when human forces operate under a condition called threat to protected persons, which is the tactical equivalent of a different kind of human entirely showing up to the fight. The human fleet did not fight defensively, did not fight by regulation, did not fight to maintain position. It fought the way I have heard old soldiers describe it, completely and all at once, and with a particular intensity of people who had decided that the thing they were protecting was worth whatever the cost. His fleet was not destroyed. That was also a decision. 6 of his cruisers were crippled and held in place. His flagship was damaged, not critically but enough. The remaining functional drag 3 vessels were boxed in a configuration from which they could not maneuver without passing through human fire lanes. The strike force was in the language of naval engagement. Finished, Admiral Bray sent him the terms the Velhari would retain full sovereignty over their system and all adjacent shipping lanes. DRA-3 forces would withdraw entirely within 72 hours. In exchange, all DRA-3 wounded were to be brought to the Florence Nightingale for treatment, and they would be returned to their own vessels or to DRA-3 space, alive and treated when the withdrawal was complete. I was informed of the terms by the Admiral himself, who came to the trauma center and told me while I was charting. That's the deal, I said. Yes, you're returning their wounded to them. We are, he said. That was always the plan. We don't want prisoners. We want them out of this system, and we want them to leave with a specific memory of who we are and how we operate. I thought about Officer Renick, about his 11 days in Bay 2, about you're not what we were told. I understand. I said human wounded came first because they were here and accessible. 2 fatalities in the engagement, 2 people who had been alive this morning and were not anymore. And I sat with that fact the way you sit with any such fact, fully and without flinching, because to flinch from it is to diminish it, and it does not deserve to be diminished. Then the DRA-3 wounded began to arrive, brought over on shuttle transports under white flags, and we received them the same way we received everyone, by asking what was wrong and then fixing it. Some of them were frightened, some of them were angry, some of them looked at the white coats moving around them with the same expression Officer Renick had worn on the first morning, a kind of profound confusion in the gap between what they had expected and what they found. I treated 43 Drag 3 personnel over the following 48 hours. 43 people who had hours before been part of a fleet that fired on a civilian ship full of families, and who are now in my care and who are going to leave this ship alive, because that is what we do, and because the only alternative is to become something I have no interest in becoming. The last one left on the morning of the 3rd day, as the DRA-3 fleet completed its withdrawal from a system. I watched the shuttle depart from the viewport of my office, and I wrote in my log, 43 all returned, all alive. Then I closed the log and turned around because Consul Saravin was standing in my doorway. He had been coming by every day to check on his people, which I had come to appreciate. He was not the kind of dignitary who observed from a distance. He learned the names of the nurses. He sat in the waiting room and talked to the families. He was, I thought, a genuinely good person in an impossible situation, which is a combination that usually produces either someone very strong or someone who breaks, and it had produced in him something that resembled both at once. He looked at the empty viewport, at the space where the Drag 3 fleet had been. They're gone, he said. Yes, he was quiet. For a moment. You returned there. Wounded? Yes. They fired on the Veleret. Yes, he looked at me. I do not understand your people, he said. I mean that honestly. I have been trying to understand you for 26 days, and I still do not. I sat down my desk and picked up my coffee, which was cold. Why don't you understand? You fight like, he searched for the word, like you're not afraid of anything. We're afraid of plenty of things, and then you heal the people you fight. He shook his head as though it is the same impulse. I considered that. Maybe it is. I said we've been doing both for as long as we've been a species. I think somewhere along the way they stopped being separate things. He was quiet again. Then he said, "We asked for doctors. You did, and you brought all of this." Yes, he looked at me steadily. Was it worth it, I thought. About the two people who did not come back from the engagement, I thought. About the child Callum saved, I thought. About 209 people on the Velhar who were alive because a 24-year-old lieutenant named Oliver Webb made a fast decision about a drifting shuttle 11 days ago, which had led to Officer Renick surviving, which had in ways I could not trace completely but could feel the shape of, contributed to the particular silence in Croft's command room when I walked in and told him what was not allowed. Small things, connected things, the kind of causality that you can only see when you look backward. Yes, I said. I believe it was. He nodded once slowly. In the Velhari way, that means something closer to "I will hold that answer and examine it" than it means "I agree." Then he said very quietly, "Thank you, Commander." I looked at my cold coffee. "Get some sleep, Console. You look like you haven't slept properly in a month." 26 days, he said. Close enough. Months after the engagement were a different kind of work from the work of the engagement itself, and in some ways harder because the crisis had given everyone a shape to move in, and when the shape is removed, the human body does not immediately know how to fill the space. We stayed in the Velshara system for 6 weeks after the withdrawal, supporting reconstruction of the orbital infrastructure that the DRA-3C had damaged and continuing medical operations for the civilian population. I established a rotation schedule that finally reluctantly allowed my senior staff to sleep. Callum took 4 days completely off and spent them doing something he told me was gardening in the small hydroponic bay that medical staff were allowed to use for personal projects. I did not question it. The hydroponic bay produced very good tomatoes, and Callum came back from his 4 days with a slightly different quality in his eyes, which is the quality that I think of as refilled. Petra organized the documentation, thousands of patient files, procedural record, supply chain logs, outcome data. She worked with the same meticulous focus she brought to everything, and she produced a report that I read and thought was one of the best pieces of medical documentation I had seen in my career. Oliver Webb went back to his ship. He came to say goodbye the morning his transfer was processed, and he stood in the corridor outside the trauma center looking slightly uncertain about whether a handshake was the right register. For the moment, I decided it was not, and hugged him briefly, which seemed to surprise him, and then told him he had good instincts and should trust them. The shuttle retrieval, he said. I wasn't sure if I get in trouble for not clearing it up the chain first. You made the right call, I said. I just figured. He paused. He was alive. That seemed like the relevant fact. It was. I said it is. Remember that? He nodded and left. And I watched him go down the corridor and thought, yes, I'm exactly that person. That is what I want more of. 6 weeks after the battle, I was informed of my new assignment. The Joint Velhari Human Medical Station, named after some back and forth that I was not involved in. The Velshar Cooperative Medical Facility, first of its kind in this sector. I was asked to serve as its founding director. I was given 72 hours to decide. I spent most of those 72 hours telling myself I did not want the position, which was how I knew I was going to take it. I'm not someone who has ever found it easy to stop once You're inside a thing, inside the work. Of it, the reason of it, the why of it. The stopping feels like a kind of abandonment. I knew that the Velhari system was going to need years of ongoing medical support, not just for the immediate damage from the siege, but for the longer, quieter damage that follows any sustained crisis. The respiratory conditions that develop after prolonged atmospheric disruption. The psychological weight that accumulates in a population that has spent months under the shadow of an occupying fleet, the infrastructure gaps that ripple through public health in ways that take a decade to fully surface. I knew that, and I knew I was one of the people most suited to address it, and I knew that the decision had already made itself before I was aware of having made it. I accepted the position. Consulave, when I told him, was quiet for a long moment, then he smiled, which is a Velhari expression that involves the area around the eyes more than the mouth, in which I had learned over the past 2 months to recognize and to value. You will stay, he said. For a while, I said, will there be warships? I considered this probably small patrol presence, I said, for the safety of the station. He nodded. We will adjust, he said, which was, I thought, the most Velhari sentence I had ever heard him say. Construction began. Within a month, the station took shape. In orbit over Sharthith Prime, slowly and then quickly, the way construction always does when the people building it are motivated. I worked out of temporary facilities on the surface while the orbital structure was assembled above me, treating patients and training local Velhari medical personnel and writing the operational protocols for the facility. I trained a young Velhari doctor named Sarah. He was quick and careful and had that quality that the best students have of asking questions at exactly the moment the answer becomes available, so that the question and the discovery arrive together. He followed me on rounds every morning, and we talked through every case with the detailed attention that I believe is the foundation of good medicine. Not the procedures, not the equipment, though both matter, but the thinking, the process of actually looking at a person and asking what is wrong and why and what it requires. One morning, about 3 months into the construction period, Sarah and I were walking the surface clinic when he stopped and looked up at the sky. The station was visible in orbit by then, a structural skeleton beginning to take on its full shape, catching the light of its star at certain angles. Commander Oe, he said. Yes. I've been thinking about something. I waited. You came here because we asked for doctors, he said, but you brought everything else, the fleet, the legal mechanism, all of it. He paused. Do humans always do that? I thought about the question, about 19 years of practice, about the outer colony field work, the relief missions, the post I had held, and the crisis I had moved through, about the Florence Nightingale's white hull and her 412 medical staff and her absolute absence of weapons, and about the 114 warships that had followed her like a shadow that was not a shadow but a fact. I thought about Officer Rennick saying, "You're not what we were told," and about the message that had come from Subby Jim and Krath privately 6 weeks after the withdrawal, addressed to me personally, and not to Admiral Bray, which had read, "Your people are not what we were told." That was all. No further content, no request, just that one line which I had read 3 times and then filed because I did not know what to do with it, and because sometimes the right response to a thing is to let it exist without Answering it, I looked up at the station, taking shape in the sky above us. Yes, I said, we always do that. We have been doing it since before we left our own planet. I paused, trying to find the most honest version of what I wanted to say. We come in peace, we genuinely do. But we learned a very long time ago that peace does not keep itself, and that the people who need help most are usually the ones least able to protect themselves while they're receiving it. So yes, we bring the ships, we bring the weapons, and we bring the surgeons and the nurses and the blood supply and the bone regenerators, because someone's going to need them when it is over, and we would rather it be us providing the care than someone else deciding who deserves it. Sarah looked at the sky for another moment, then he said, when I tell my children about this time, what should I call what you did? I thought about it. Just call it medicine, I said. We treated a system that was sick. We removed what was causing the damage. We supported the recovery. That is medicine. We just do it at a scale that other people find surprising. He smiled. He had learned to smile in a human way, which I appreciated, though also loved the Vilhari. I smiled and made sure to tell him so. We went back to work. The station opened 7 months after construction began on a clear morning, when the light through the viewports was the particular warm blue of Velshar star. At midday, the dedication ceremony was attended by Consul, now elevated to the full Vilhari Council, and by Admiral Bray, who had flown in from his current posting and who shook my hand without the distracted quality of the first time, and said, "Well done, Commander," in a way that felt like he meant something larger than the words. There were representatives from 11 other species present, most of them there because they had decided that the Velshar situation was worth watching closely, and that the medical station was the most legible version of what they wanted to understand about humanity. I gave a short address. I talked about medicine. I talked about what the word means when you expand its scope, when you ask not just how do we treat the person in front of us, but how do we treat the conditions that put them here and the conditions that threaten them while they recover. I talked about the Florence Nightingale, which was currently 3 systems away on a new mission with a new medical crew, and I had been informed of slightly updated designation that now included the words medical and escort in the same sentence on her official registration. I talked about Callum Rowe and Petra Hale and Oliver Webb because they deserve to be named, and I named them clearly and without diminishment. I did not talk about the battle because the battle was not the point. The battle was a consequence, and consequences are not stories. They are what happens when you take something seriously enough to see it through. After the ceremony, I went to my office on the station, my first permanent office in nearly a decade, with a real window that showed the planet below instead of the recycled air sameness of a ship corridor. And I opened my log. I wrote for a while. I wrote about the beacon at 3:47 and the response time in the 4 minutes that it felt wrong. I wrote about Consul Savin's face and Officer Rennick's silence and the look in the draw officer's eyes when I walked the length of their command room in a white coat. I wrote about Callum on the floor of the scrub area and Oliver's fast decision, and the child from the Velhart whose name I will not write here because some things belong only to the people who lived through them. Then I wrote this, which I have not changed since I wrote it, because it came out right the first Time and does not need improvement. We are a species that cannot separate. Caring from defending, every place we have ever gone to help, we have also gone to protect. Every mission we have called humanitarian has been flanked by people whose job it was to ensure that the mission could complete. Other species look at this and see contradiction. They see the white coat and the worship, and they cannot reconcile the image. They ask which is the real humanity. Both, I think both are real, and both have always been present. And the fact that we hold them at the same time is not a contradiction. It is just us. It is just what we are, the species that crawled out of a difficult planet and decided somewhere along the way that the things worth protecting were also the things worth healing, and that these were not two different impulses but one impulse with two hands. Sarah knocked on my door. I closed the log. A new intake, he said. Vilhari. Family from the Eastern Settlement. 2 children with respiratory complications. I stood up, put on my coat, and followed him into the corridor. Outside the viewport, a small human patrol ship moved through the quiet of the Velarath system, unhurried, steady, keeping its particular kind of watch over a world that had stopped needing to be afraid. Not because the fear had never been real, because something had come when it was asked and had not stopped until there was nothing left to fear. That, I think, is medicine. That is what we do. That is who we are.